Welcome to Mission Undercover. Joining me today is Elgin Hushbeck, author of the book Preserving Democracy, which explores the role of media in democracy and the causes of the housing crisis. He taught critical thinking at Phoenix University. We are going to dissect the political crisis that we see across our societies today, the causes of this decline, and what we must do to stop the collapse of our societies. Could you start by explaining your background and more about who you are and what core values you believe in? And what motivates you to believe in those values?
Well, yeah, I started out as an Air Force brat. My dad was in the Army and then it became the Air Force. So I actually born in England, so not a few hours north of London. Then lived my life for the first 18 years, bouncing around from military base to military base. I served 4 years active duty myself, and then retired to the private sector. I figured 22 years involved with the military was enough. So after that, went to college, worked primarily in technology, worked for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where I was privileged enough to be a small part of the Voyager encounter with Neptune. And I worked on a new and emerging technology you might have heard of called GPS. I think it's emerged by now. Worked at a number of different tech firms over the years, had my own company for about 10 years, university level courses, primarily a lot of technology, but also critical thinking courses, which I enjoyed quite a bit. Ended my career in management and retired a couple of years ago. So over that whole time, I've also a writer. So I've written a number of books on Christian apologetics, on politics, on philosophy, history. So yeah, I like to study a lot of different things, and my love of politics probably came from my parents, primarily my mother, who was very involved. My dad, as an Air Force officer, was not allowed to participate directly in politics, so most of that was through my mother, who at one point was a state party chairman, or at least acting state party chairman. They kept trying to get her to take it formally, and she didn't really want it. She primarily worked with volunteers and just didn't really want the hassle till they could find somebody. For about 2 years, she was the start party chairman of the state of Nevada.
I want to start by talking about geopolitics because right now this is the most pressing issue.
Hmm.
What's your assessment of the Iran war and what do you think will happen next for the US, but also for the wider region? Is this really the start of World War III, as some analysts have stipulated?
Well, like most issues, it's extremely complex. There's no real simple yes or no. I don't tend to believe a lot in binaries where you either yes or no, true or false, one side or the other. As to what's going to happen, it's a war. And I've done enough studying in wars. I mean, the general assessment of pretty much all sides in World War One was that it was time for a war. We needed a quick war, kind of get it out of our systems, and everybody pretty much agreed it would last 30 days. And of course, they all thought they would win. 4 years later, 20 million dead, turned out somewhat different than what they had planned. You never know what's going to happen. It's one of the big dangers in war. So far, seems pretty one sided. In terms of, I thought it was kind of inevitable that we would uh, have to do something with Iran at one point or another. I've been following that closely since literally 1979, where I happen to live in Wisconsin. We have a candidate for the House of Representatives who was actually one of the 440 hostages in Tehran during the takeover of the embassy in 1979. He was one of the Marine guards who was captured. So it's not something I just stumbled across. For example, I view Iran getting a nuclear weapon and North Korea getting a nuclear weapon as vastly different propositions. North Korea getting a nuclear weapon was extremely undesirable because they just are not a stable regime, but they're not a suicidal regime. If Iran got a nuclear weapon, I was under the belief that they would use it. In fact, I remember a interview a decade or two ago with one of the Iranian generals, and the reporter asked him, he said, if you get a nuclear weapon and use it on Israel, Israel has nuclear weapons. They'll use them back on you. And the general said, yeah, we might lose 10 to 40 million people in such an exchange, but Israel would be gone. And it was pretty clear from the way he was expressing it that was a good exchange. Them getting a nuclear weapon, I didn't think if they got one that they would have it for long before they used it. Not like North Korea. So getting rid of it, I think was a good thing. In terms of if, and it's a big if we could get the regime there to be a more democratic regime, the Iranian people, the Persians, have not liked the government for a long time. And you've seen periodic revolutions, attempts at revolutions, the Green Revolution going back during the Obama era, and the more recent uprisings. So I think there would be significant change, and the region would be far more peaceful. And one of the things everyone pretty much agrees on, at least here in the United States, even those who are opposed to the war, Republicans and Democrats, is that Iran has been the largest state sponsor of terrorism around the world. So getting rid of it's a good thing if we can do that. And what will happen in the intern, those are still up for grabs. This is the future, and I'm better at the history than I am at the future.
I think a lot of this situation is tainted by media bias because the media refuses to highlight the fact that Israel still denies that it has nuclear weapons, despite having had them for decades, and is consistently propagating the myth that Iran is trying to destroy and disrupt the peace of the region, when actually the real threat to regional security and stability is Israel. And there's no power in the region that is opposing them except for Iran. And that is why they're drawing so much support from across the world. But there are also so many parallels between this and Iraq. Our international institutions are still toothless, and our world is distorted to favor the American empire, and the systems that we have in place serve to perpetuate American hegemony, and they completely ignore the illegal actions that are taking place. So, how can we actually strengthen international law to stop illegal wars and to ensure justice around the world? Whether that is deposing dictatorial regimes that are threatening their own people, or stopping illegal invasions that are threatening the security of the region, or stopping genocides of innocent people.
Well, consistency would help. I mean, there have been genocides all around the world, and they tend to get completely ignored, uh, unless unless somebody has a political stake that they want to inflate. You know, how you the biggest thing you can do in terms of becoming a credible source is to be consistent. And too much of the media, and this goes on the both the right and the left, have been inconsistent. They will praise X if it supports them, and they will condemn X if it's against them. And if it doesn't bother them, they tend to ignore it completely. Getting a consistent news source, and they're hard to find, is difficult. Dispute in Israel is, it's been my entire lifetime, and you could argue that it kind of goes back 2,000 years. But until you get some consistency in all of that, you're not going to get any resolution. I would say in Israel's favor is you have the Abraham Accords. They pretty much made peace with anybody who's willing to make peace with them. They made peace with Egypt. They gave back the Sinai. And I'm not saying that the relations between Israel and Egypt since then have been, just absolutely stellar, but they've not gone back to war. You have the Abraham Accords where they've made a number of different peace arrangements with a number of their neighbors. So, yeah, you've got to get consistency and be able to condemn everybody or nobody. But if you're only condemning people who are you're fundamentally against, and yet you praise the same thing when it happens on your side, or you ignore it, then you have no consistency at all.
I completely agree with what you're saying. And I think that the reforms that you're talking about and having consistency on a global level is not possible unless we reform global institutions, because currently the world is structured to have a system of imperialism, whether that imperial power is China, Russia, or America. So, what I advocate for is that we reform the UN by abolishing veto powers that give outsized power to the empires and countries that already have power in the world. So veto powers in the UN Security Council obstruct justice, so they should be removed. But the problem is that they won't be removed because those powers have veto powers. But we also need to reform other institutions like the IMF and the World Trade Organization, because these institutions are creating global inequality by perpetuating ideas of austerity and neoliberalism and supporting the hegemony of the US dollar. America's entire power stems from the dollar's dominance across the world. So, what I also advocate for is a neutral global reserve currency to denominate trade. John Maynard Keynes proposed this at the Bretton Woods Conference decades ago, but this proposal was rejected because of America's personal desire to maintain empirical dominance. So, How do you think we can reform the global order? How do you think we should respond to this rupture in the global order? As Mark Carney said, this is a rupture, not a transition. So how do we respond to it?
Change is always extremely difficult. And there's also the question of what do you change to? And you can say, okay, it's easy to always point out the flaws of the current system, but it's difficult to understand the flaws of what you're going to. So, I mean, you look back at the U.S. Constitution, something I've studied in depth, its ratification process, and how it was adopted, and what they were trying to do, and then there's what they actually accomplished, and those weren't exactly the same. And so you look at how do you make a change. And I always divide policies up into where are you going and how do you get there. For example, there's a lot of talk, for example, in the United States about getting rid of the income tax and going to another type of tax, right? And it's got pros and cons, and like everything else, I don't think it'll ever happen, because even if you can come up fairly easily with a better tax. The question is how do you get there? And most of these, well, there's short term and long term transition issues. Short term, okay, but then there's long term. What about you're just going to attack? Say you're just, for sake of argument, you're only going to tax people when they spend money. The United States does not have a national sales tax. We tax income. So you can tax money when you earn it, or you can tax money when you spend it. And you can say, well, taxing spending is far, far more efficient and much better way to do things. Okay. Well, then what about I'm a bit older. What about people at retirement? So you taxed all their money when they earned it, but you didn't tax it when you spend it. Now you're going to change the system and tax when they spend it rather than when they earned it. Well, what of that person that spent their whole life paying taxes on the income they earn? Now they have to spend the rest of their life paying taxes again on the money that has already been taxed, because now they're spending it. Those type of issues enter in. So when you talk about a world organization, okay, I can easily come up with what I think personally would be better world organizations, such as what about a organization like the UN, but where the requirements for admission where you had to be a real democracy, right? And of course, now you got all kinds of problems about how you define what a real democracy is. But let's say you could figure that out. So if you're a dictatorship or a one party state, like if you're one like Russia, where they have the vestiges of a democracy, but that place is run by Putin, and Putin makes the laws, and okay, well, if you how do you get there, and how do you make that transition to a union of democracies as opposed to a union of states? Because now we have the UN. It's literally almost a joke, because you'll have countries with huge human rights violations who are the head of the UN committee on human rights because it was their turn. So, and then what do you do with an organization like that, right? So I don't know. If you had good, respectable international organizations, then okay, that's one argument. I don't see many out there, and I'm not sure how we would get to one. If you could, if you could create one, how would you do the transitions? How would you even create it? So, yeah.
I think the European Union is quite a good model based on what you're talking about. They only admit countries that meet certain requirements of
Hmm.
democratic accountability and fair
Yeah.
systems in their country. But I don't think that would work on a global level without having some neutral authority, because someone would always have a higher level of control due to higher economic power or higher military strength. So it's definitely something that we need to look at to have global solutions to these global issues. We obviously need cooperation, but we also need to put justice at the center point of the solutions that we look for. But I want to ask you about what your view is on free trade and globalization, because this is the characteristic and trend that has dominated our world ever since the end of World War II, and we've seen deindustrialization in Western nations. What does the future look like amidst the rising tide of protectionism and tariffs under the Trump administration?
Again, you're predicting the future, and I'm not good at that. But I can state my principles. My principles are I'm for I'm a free trader, and I've been a free trader for a very long time. But we've never actually had free trade. One of the reasons Trump is as popular and in the United States and being able to implement tariffs is because, quite frankly, he's right. The United States has been taken advantage of for many years. We've not had tariffs against countries who had tariffs against us, including our friends in, like, for example, in Japan. Pretty much impossible to sell an American car in Japan because of all the restrictions and trade regulations. And so, how do you set up a regime to replace it and be fair? That's really difficult. Now, one of the problems I have with the EU is, now I'm not in the EU. I'm looking at it from afar, but I'm not sure. I'm actually pretty sure I wouldn't want the United States to join the EU because sovereignty is being transferred up out of the hands. And I see, like friends in England. England left. They had Brexit. They left the EU. There's rumblings of other countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, wanting to do the same. So, but again, you have the issues of, well, okay, it's easy to leave. What do you do then? So I don't know. There's, in many of these things, there's pros and cons. They're not good solutions. And like I said, it's easy to point out the problems of the EU, but how do you actually intelligently discuss going to something else when there isn't anything else? And current problems against future dreams, the current problems are always going to lose because those are visible and they're hurting people directly. The future dreams is, what are the downsides? If you say there's no downsides, then I'm not going to believe you, because there's downsides to everything. There are pros and cons to everything. So I see a lot of our discussions having trouble because we're talking literally apples and oranges. We're talking about, these are the current problems of the system, and these are the hopes and dreams of where I want to go. And that sort of, biases the problem real quick to where you front loaded your conclusion into your basic question. So, yeah, could we do better? Yes, and I hope we will one day. But I don't see it. Any grand transformation is more likely to cause more problems than it is. Like it or not, and I don't particularly like it, but I think incremental improvements are a better way to do it. And for example, you have Trump and his tariffs, right? Now, there are pros and cons to his tariffs, and there are pros and cons to it before. And I think this is a somewhat needed correction, at least from my perspective in the United States. I can remember back in the 80s and 90s having discussions with people about free trade. And it's like, but why can't we? And it's like, oh, no, you can't do that because if you do anything, you'll get a trade war. Well, Trump has shown that's not possible. So, okay, or not currently on the table. So, okay, fine. Now, can we go back and start making even more minor? The pendulum was this way, it's now swung that way. Now, can we now try to get it back towards the middle a bit, and what would really be good for everyone? Not saying I have that answer right now, but I think that's where the conversation, if we spent more time talking about where we can make small improvements, I think overall the systems will get small but incrementally better, and we'll move to a better place, as opposed to, no, we need to toss the current system out and come in, right?
Yeah, I think you're right that pushing through radical change is far more difficult and far more arduous, and it also creates more upheaval than pushing through incremental changes over a long period of time. But the danger of incrementalism is that nothing really changes, and we're seeing that with our government over here, that they're trying to push through incremental changes, but people aren't feeling the difference, and people become increasingly disillusioned with the system. And in some areas, we do see a need for radical change. And I also want to circle back to what you said about Brexit. I think that Brexit was a worthy sacrifice because of that idea of sovereignty and direct democracy. If we're delegating democracy to bureaucrats, then I don't think that's a sustainable model and system that we can have as a democracy. And I think that we have to bring power as close as possible towards people's communities. That's why I want to ask you about political reform. How do you think that do you think that it's viable to have decentralization and direct democracy where
Oh,
we
yeah.
have citizens assemblies and give voices directly to the people who are affected by decisions that are being made by people in power?
Yep. That was actually the original model in the United States. When the founders set up the Constitution, they initially set up the Articles of Confederation, which had very, very little power at the federal level. And any state could veto anything. So basically nothing happened. And they realized that was not a sustainable model. And so they held the Constitutional Convention ostensibly to reform, but they didn't reform. I actually, in the notes of the convention, you can see like day 3, they go, yeah, we're tossing this out. Here's what, now we're going to start scratching. Here's something new. So it wasn't a reform, it was a rewrite. But in the rewrite, they didn't switch to total federal power. They went incrementally. The United States is still a confederation of states, and it's still that way. That's why we don't directly elect our president. The states elect the president. And within each state, we elect our electors who then go on to elect the president. So, that was one of those nice ideas that didn't quite work out the way they thought it was going to be because of just reality. But it's still a viable system where the states, are looking, the United States is a very large country. If you look at an electoral map for, say, any president, particularly a Republican president, you will see, like, for example, red will represent the Republicans and blue the Democrats. And if you just look at a map of Trump or Bush or anybody, the country's red with these little blue spots. Well, the blue spots are the large population centers. So you have the vast amount of the country being a Republican country, and then you have these concentrations of Democrats basically on the East Coast, on the West Coast, and then particularly in big cities like Chicago. That's where we are today, and we're split. Now, the way their fathers originally set it up is most of your encounter with government as an average, everyday citizen would be with your local government, your city, right? If things kind of escalated a bit or you really had something, well, then you go to the state, and the state would. And only on rare occasions would you actually ever get involved with the federal government. In fact, we had a saying which really doesn't apply anymore. But when I grew up, when I was young, there was a saying that said, don't make a federal issue out of it, which was, this is too small. Don't try to make it bigger than it really is. So that was our original model, and that model existed up basically until Franklin Roosevelt in the mid 30s, 1930s. So, 140 years thereabouts. And then Franklin Roosevelt kind of reversed that, where he vastly changed the dynamics of the federal government, where it became dominant. And today, the federal government is now involved in everything. And they do it through lots of different ways. One of the big issues I'm involved in constitutional reform, and one of the issues in constitutional reform is the reestablishment of the intended meaning of the Constitution. There are two ways of interpreting the Constitution. One's called living Constitution, and the other is called originalism. And under living Constitution, the judge is supposed to interpret what the Constitution should mean given today's context. And the originalists say, no, you understand it as it was understood when it was written. And then you go up to the courts, the Supreme Court would rule on cases where it wasn't clear what they found it. Like, for example, current case before the court's going to be, I think it's going to get argued on Wednesday, that we had the 14th Amendment because of slavery. And the 14th Amendment said, if you're born in the United States, you are an American citizen, right? And that was and there's some other language in there about jurisdictions and authorities. But basic intent was, there was a concern that the Democrats would overturn the right of blacks to have citizenship. And so they wanted to ensure that any black who was born in the United States would be a citizen of the United States. This is 1860s. So that's the time frame we're talking. And they passed it, right? Then it was ruled on in right around 1900 with a Chinese immigrant. His parents had moved from China to the United States, remaining Chinese citizens. They lived in the United States for several years I think it was the San Francisco area. They lived for many, many years. He was born, and then they decided to go back, but he was old enough, he stayed in the United States. They went back to China. They were subjects of the Emperor of China. He decided to visit them on vacation. So he that time. He took a steamer to China. He came back from China, and immigration wouldn't let him in, saying he wasn't a U.S. citizen. That case went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled, he was born here. His parents were here legally. They didn't quite put it that way, but they were. And therefore, he's a citizen by birth. Okay, now we fast forward to today. Does a illegal immigrant who comes across the border and has a child, is that child an American citizen? Are they under the jurisdiction? If they're here illegally, are they under the jurisdiction of the United States? So that decision is going up right now to the Supreme Court, because there's, how do you say what the original intent was when the original concept didn't really apply? And that's a legitimate place for the courts to make a decision.
I actually want to talk more about immigration because tensions have risen a lot because of the amount of immigration that's increased because of the warfare we've seen over the past few decades, but also the need to plug labor shortages in Western nations due to deindustrialization. Communities have become increasingly disillusioned because they feel like they're being neglected. They feel like the communities are being favored are those that are coming in from abroad rather than the communities that are actually born in the same country.
Oh, yeah.
But it's also been contributed to by media vilifying immigrants and making them a target, especially certain communities like Muslims. So, could you assess the causes of this migration crisis and what these tensions could lead to in the future? And I also want to ask, what do you think of the ICE raids? Because some people are saying, and rightly so, that they're actually eroding democracy and they're eroding the rights of American citizens and targeting innocent people. Is Trump taking the right approach towards irregular migration?
Well, as usual, lots of things buried in there. Illegal immigration. I mean, there's a big distinction between legal, at least I make, between legal immigration and illegal immigration. Right? I, for one, and a lot of people that I know around me, are very welcoming to legal immigration. Where we begin to question it is when it's illegal. It's in the name, illegal. They shouldn't be here. So, in terms of workers, you know what? To me, that's just basic economics, right? If you flood an area with workers, you will drive wages down. There's just no question about it. That's just the way economics works. You can say it shouldn't be that way, wish it wasn't that way, whatever, but that's what happens. It happens in my field. I was in IT, right? One of these big high earning fields, right? And kept hearing for my entire career, we kept hearing, we don't have enough IT people. We need to get more IT people, right? We're not generating. We have a term called STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. We need more of STEM people. We're just not producing enough, except, I look into the figures on it. 25% of people with STEM degrees actually work in STEM. And we graduate more people with STEM degrees every year than we create new STEM jobs. And one point in my career, I was in the boardroom because I had worked up my way. I was kind of sitting off to the side in the back, but I was at least in the room. And, the company I worked for, a small company, 120 people at the time. And they said, we need a new engineer. And the owner of the company said, I only want H-1B visa people, which is the program in the United States that allows us to bring people in from other countries. So I only want H-1B visa people because they're a lot cheaper. Now, they're technically not supposed to be. If you look at the letter of the law, they're not supposed to be. But wink and a nod here, and actually, next thing you know, they are cheaper. So in my career field, I consider myself lucky. I went through my entire career and I retired, even though I ended up being forced to retire a year early. I retired in my career. A lot of the people I worked with over the years couldn't do that because their jobs, I literally talked to people who they were getting laid off and their final job was to train their replacement from another country because the person was cheaper. So yeah, there are big concerns there. How do you deal with that? Again, misinformation and stuff. A lot, most of the people, there are two big groups of people that have left the country, but those who left voluntarily, which is the vast majority of them, because they see the handwriting on the law and they know that Trump is cracking down. And then the people they removed, the vast majority of which have criminal records or are to be removed. So where you're getting a lot of the problems with ICE is you have sanctuary cities, which this gets down in the weeds. I'm not going to go there, but they're technically illegal under the supremacy clause in our Constitution. Federal law trumps state law. So the idea that states can control immigration is just not a factor. And in fact, this is one of those consistency issues I mentioned. When Biden was in office, there were a lot of Republicans trying to, in various states, particularly Arizona, that were trying to pass laws to restrict illegal immigrants. And the Supreme Court ruled, nope, that is a federal issue. You're not allowed to do that. Well, now Trump's in office, and the same people that said no, only the federal government are doing this are now arguing no, we're letting these states do this. That's where you get a consistency problem. So I think they're right. The reason it's died down is I think there's a wink and a nod going on, which is in theory, if you get arrested and for like there was a criminal recently, a illegal alien who was arrested for raping a 5-year-old girl so badly she had to have surgery to repair the damage. And the state would not turn him over to the federal government to be arrested because normally that's what happened. They put in a warrant. The ICE agents would come into the police department. They would pick him up and take him away, right? Nice and safe and no problem. Well, that was where a lot of the controversies were coming in because they weren't letting these people, they're just turning them back on the streets to do it again. And we've had numerous accounts of people killed, like the student in Chicago last week who was killed by an illegal immigrant who was let out of jail. The Ukrainian woman on the train in South Carolina a couple of months ago, she's just sitting on a subway and the illegal immigrant comes up behind her and stabs her, and he had been in prison a whole bunch of times. So, well, now what happened is that guy who raped the girl, they wouldn't turn him over, but somehow ICE knew to be right outside the front door. So as he walked, or the door he was leaving, so as he walked out the door, they arrested him. So they don't have to turn him over, but I think someone quietly, okay, which is why you're not seeing the complaints that you were seeing. So I actually think there should be a temporary work program so that, and we used to have one, it was called the Bracero program, that would allow immigrants to come in the country legally. They would be protected by the law. Employers couldn't exploit them. And at the end of their time, they would go back. And that seemed to work really well. Why we got rid of it in the 1960s, that's when we reformed immigration and created our current problem.
Yeah, let me address some of the points you raised. Obviously, there is a bit of a risk of generalizations with this type of thing. Obviously, there are some who are criminals. There are some people who commit bad acts, but that doesn't mean we generalize based on those specific people. And also, it's an issue of we should control the flows of migration because obviously, for what you call illegal migrants, I call it irregular migrants. They don't have much opportunities to access that they can gain legal migration to a country because all the routes to legal migration are being restricted as much as possible by governments to satisfy the thirst for reducing migration. And that is causing a real problem because the countries need migration. People want to come, but there are no routes to come. So they resort to irregular migration. And I think that a part of the solution for what you're saying is that we have workforce plans and we actually try and train workers domestically as well, not just rely on immigration. So we have things like job guarantees, and we have temporary visas as well, which we have in the UK to temporarily get workers to plug temporary shortages and then replace them with domestically trained workers afterwards. We also have something here called the minimum salary threshold to prevent that issue of wages that you were talking about. So we have a pretty high minimum salary threshold so that it doesn't drive down wages in local areas and it actually maintains high level of skill within the economy from external migrant workers. But the main reason for what you're talking about, that there's no jobs in the specific area that people are trained in, is because of financialization of the economy. The economy has become increasingly oriented towards financial services and it's neglected real economic activity because the economy is completely directed towards speculative finance. All of the economic activity that is happening right now is in AI and
Mm-hmm.
is in profit shifting and financial trading like forex trading, and that's not creating real economic value. It's only creating financial speculation. It's only creating economic instability, and the real economy is being neglected. That's why there's no jobs outside of finance, and so much talent is being sucked away by the corporate sector. So I think the solutions that we need here are more safe and legal routes and an evidence-based approach to policymaking. We have like something like a yearly migration plan. How we have a yearly budget for finances, we should have a yearly migration plan that determines how many people come in based on the needs of the economy and the ability of public services to deal with the influx of people.
Yeah. Well, I agree with a lot of that. I just don't think when you have one of the huge problems I have with illegal immigration is it's virtually impossible to enforce any of that. If you have legal means, like we had with the Bacero program and other programs, then yes, and if they're followed, you can track that. But for example, we've had several incidences recently of illegal immigrants who have been given commercial driver's license driving trucks and of killing people in accidents. Now, a generalization, yeah, there's no question in my mind that the vast majority of the people who come here legally or illegally are fine, wonderful people. In fact, one of the ways I would have you have to, there's I talk about transition. One of the issues I have with transition is how do you let the people who are here legally or illegally, yet you're legalizing them? How do you decide who's going to stay and who's not going to stay? Right. I've thought about that. I think I have some ways that you could do that. The problem is when you do it illegally, I've heard some truck drivers companies, right? Small companies. I mean, we always nice to talk about the big corporations are out of reach. But in the United States, a lot of trucking companies are small trucking companies. They have 30 or 40 trucks, right? And they're having a huge problem because if they pay their drivers what they would normally get on the market, then the rates they have to charge are too high and they can't compete with the smaller companies that are hiring nothing but illegal aliens and kind of doing a week and a nod on the system, and then they can cut their rates really low and they can get all the business. So that's one of the problems with illegal immigration. Yeah, you could say they're getting rid of all the jobs. At the same time, they're complaining about they don't have enough IT people. They're replacing the IT people with H-1B visas from overseas, right? So they're on the one hand claiming they don't have enough workers. On the other hand, they're saying we need to bring people in from overseas. And again, that stat, only 25% of the people with STEM degrees actually work in STEM. They've had to go off and find other types of jobs because they're not there. And yet they're saying we have a desperate need for STEM. There's this is where finding somebody who is actually very consistent and willing to talk about the pros and cons of everything. So you talk about the pros of the things you like and the cons of the things you don't. But if you can't do both sides, then you have no consistency and no track record, and you literally can't be trusted. So yeah, there's definitely, in many respects, it's a huge mess, and I don't know how we get out of that. One of the big problems is, you have a sanctuary city. Why are all these cities bringing in millions of illegal aliens? Estimates are now that we have about 20 to 30 million illegal immigrants in the United States, right? That's not a small number. Now, particularly with our dynamics, we actually give congressional appropriations based on the census, and in the census, they count people, not citizens. And so you figure 880,000 people is what's in a congressional district of the United States. Well, if 880,000 people represents one congressional district, one congressman, and you have 30 million people, well, how many congressmen is that? And then you begin to wonder why the blue states who are losing population are suddenly bringing in lots of warm bodies so they can be counted in the census and they can get representation in Congress, right? We have a very tightly split Congress right now. There's only like a 1 or 2 seat difference. Well, figure 30 of those seats are influenced by illegal immigrants in the country. If you got rid of those 30 seats, and you could say, well, both sides do it. No, the sanctuary cities are almost all in blue states. So you could argue that the Democrats currently have, at least 10, if not 20 extra seats because of illegal immigration. So they have a big advantage. The politicians that set up the sanctuary cities have a huge advantage of bringing in people here illegally, not because they're serving their citizens. I mean, you go to Chicago, the average citizen in Chicago, their current mayor has like a 9% approval rating because he's so focused on illegal immigration. And I've seen video from city council meetings and stuff where people are very upset that they're spending all their time on the illegals and the homeless. They're not spending time on the citizens. So these things get very complicated very quickly.
I think a bigger issue with democracy than that, obviously that's quite a risk, but I think that a bigger issue is that corporate influence is dictating the priorities that government has. Corporate lobbying is dictating the priorities of government rather than the say of real people. So do you think that state funding of political parties is a viable solution
No,
to make democracy more representative?
no. I do agree with you. There's a problem there, but I don't think that's a solution. I just don't see how that would actually work. To be clear, I define capitalism as choice and competition. If you have, as a consumer, if you have choice and there's competition for your dollar, that's capitalism. when you have these, one of my big complaints with corporate capitalism, which I put the modifier in front of it to clarify that it's not true capitalism, corporate capitalism. Well, they want to control everything and basically set up an effective monopoly, if not a real monopoly. And
Yeah, it's an illusion of choice.
right. And then they use their
Ever since,
they use
yeah,
their power to, one of the big problems I have currently with corporations is they expand not by building a better widget so you want to go buy it. They expand by being so big they buy up the competition, right? And I think that's been a huge problem for decades, and that needs to be talked about and addressed. So, if government was to move more towards ensuring that consumers had more choice and competition, right now, at least in the United States, they're more focused on regulating what you can buy and how you can buy it. Well, if they focus more on making sure you had choice and competition, then let the consumers figure out which one they want the best.
yeah, definitely. Choice and competition are the ultimate virtues of capitalism, and that's what Adam Smith outlined when he initially wrote his book, The Wealth of Nations. And that's really important, and we need to safeguard that fundamental right. But ever since Thatcher and Reagan's neoliberal revolution in the late 1900s, we have entertained falsehoods about the economy. We have oriented it towards big corporations rather than supporting small businesses, rather than supporting enterprise and ingenuity. The household analogy has become so widespread and so widely believed that we believe that governments are limited in their spending, but they're not limited by the amount of money they have. As John Maynard Keynes said, we can do anything that we can afford. There's no shortage of money. The real constraint on spending is inflation. The real constraint is resources. So, what do you think of? I don't know if you heard of this modern monetary theory, and what's your perspective on neoliberalism? The modern day conservative model of capitalism, which exalts the delusion of market fundamentalism at the expense of real choice and real competition
Yeah.
that actually supports economic activity.
I reject modern monetary theory. I'm someone who's been critical and worried about the budget going back at least to Reagan, if not earlier, right? If I have a complaint, that would be it. With Reagan, that there wasn't enough attention played to that. I think that's one of the big. I mean, we tend to think of the parties, the Republican, the Democratic parties, as being similar, if not the same, in terms of year after year after year. But no, both the Democrat and the Republican Party has gone through massive changes in at least the last couple of decades. Bill Clinton, as he ran in 1992, would not even get close to the presidency today, because the Bill Clinton of 1992 is not where the Democratic Party is today. And the same with, I mean, obviously the Republican Party's not with Trump, because Trump blew up the Republican Party. Through my lifetime, Republicans had an internal battle going on between what were the establishment or country club Republicans and what was the Main Street Republicans, right? The conservatives. And slowly the conservatives were winning. The first conservative run was Goldwater, and he got beat. Reagan was the second and only conservative president we've actually ever had. Bush and Bush were not, neither of those were actual conservatives. They were a little bit closer, but Trump blew that all up. And now we have, rather than a conservative Republican Party, we have much more of a populist Republican Party where Wall Street, I mean, you get Republicans complaining about Wall Street now pretty much as easily as Democrats. In fact, frankly, Wall Street is mostly liberals. There's a myth that Republicans support the rich and Democrats support the poor. No, it's it's not even
They both
close.
support the wealth.
It's well, most of the rich are liberals. I mean, you look at, yeah, there's a occasionally you get a rich billionaire who's conservative, but for the most part, there, for every Elon Musk, there's a whole bunch of other on the left, like Soros or somebody. So there's a stat, for example, that I've watched consistently over the years, going back to the 70s, and it's called real wages. And real wages are the average wage that people make adjusted for inflation.
Yeah.
And going back to literally the 70s, real wages actually declined a lot in the 70s because of inflation, but then they basically stayed even, maybe climbed a little bit, but there's been ups and downs and ups and downs. So since the 1980s, real wages has remained roughly the same. until Donald Trump in 2016. That was the first significant jump in real wages. And then under Biden, it dropped a lot. And now under Trump, it's beginning to come up again. So that's something I look at because that's not Wall Street. That's average worker, and it's not mythical because it's adjusted for inflation. Are you getting ahead or are you falling behind? And the average view for a lot of people in the U.S. is that we've been falling behind for decades because you show you we get more money, but we also pay a lot more in taxes. And so what you actually get is prices are going up, taxes are going up. I'm retired now. My income is fixed for the rest of my life. And my only real concern is my property taxes because they tend to go up a lot and they go up faster than my income because I get a cost of living adjustment every year. But they can increase faster than I can. I remember in California in the 70s, we had a huge problem with people who had retired there after World War II. They bought houses and paid them off. So they had their house paid for free and clear, and they were getting evicted. Lots of people were getting evicted because their property taxes had gone up so much they couldn't afford to live in their homes any longer, which is not how you want to spend your retirement years. So
Yeah, I think working people are being taxed way too much, and that we do need to reduce taxes on ordinary people to actually give them more money in their pockets, and so that we actually eliminate the impact of inflation that's eroding their incomes. But I think a big cause of why the economy is so distorted towards wealth and the interests of corporate industry is because of the way that interest structures in the economy. Interest creates artificial value in the economy. It creates inherent financial instability by inflating private debt. It perpetuates inequality as the economy is diverted towards speculative finance, as I mentioned earlier. And that's why we've seen a process of financialization where talent is sucked away by corporate finance and wealth is shifted towards trading and finance. So, do you think that a zero interest economy is possible? And do you think that it would be a better economy with more stability? Because I think that the only way that we can stop this cycle of boom and bust is by reducing the amount of excess and artificial value in the economy and making sure that there's real economic activity to support real growth and real living standards.
well, my first question is how would you do it? I mean, and then what would be the pros and cons of that? There I frequently hear people complaining about X or Y or in the economy, right? And largely it's by people who don't understand why X and Y are in the economy. So you could say, for example, whenever gas prices go up, there's always this complaint about the speculators, right? Speculators actually serve a role in the market because they allow for the hedging of bets. They're sort of like a mini insurance plan, right? And of course, when they're making lots of money, everyone's complaining about them. Do they complain about them when they lose money? Because they do. I mean, I remember reading Teddy Roosevelt's autobiography, and he was talking in there where a corporation wanted to put a railroad track in. Everybody that could be involved in it seemed to agree it was a good idea and wanted to go forward. And they picked Teddy Roosevelt because they knew he was squeaky clean. He had a reputation for not only not being involved in corruption, for fighting corruption. So if they put him in charge of it, this could go through. Nobody complained about it. It's all good and well, except he couldn't do it. The reason he couldn't do it is because the other politicians wanted their cut, and there was no way to get them their cut. And Roosevelt was certainly not going to play along with that. So they ended up having to pull Roosevelt out and put a less reputable politician in charge of it, not because they wanted to have corruption, it's because government was corrupting them back. And something that we often ignore. Yes, do corporations influence government? Sure do. Does government influence corporation? You betcha. And it's like how do you got to have a plan to get rid of both, and that's the tough thing. Again, I this is where choice. I think capitalism is a great solution here because you can go back to if you ensure choice and competition, then companies that are wasting money on paying for politicians and things like that won't be able to compete with the organizations that are not. And if you allow the people to choose, then you can actually get them to make the right choices. Government. I don't see government planning, which is one of the reasons I don't. You know, um, government funded campaigns. I don't understand. Money. Yes, money can help, But there's plenty of cases where a young upstart can dethrone somebody with a bigger budget. Hey, Trump spent a fraction of what Harris did, and it didn't help her any. And she had the backings of lots of big money people, and it didn't help her any. So money is important, but it's not always determinative. And letting people actually make choices is much more effective than trying to figure out a system where you make the choices for them and somehow make the right choice.
Yeah, I definitely think that central planners can't determine economic activity as efficiently or as effectively as individual forces within the market, and that's far more effective. And I also think that we have a democratic deficit with the idea of central bank independence because we're outsourcing decisions to bureaucrats again. Like, this is a decision for democratic politicians to be taking, not for bureaucrats that are unelected to be taking. It's like saying we want to outsource taxation to outside experts and economists. So I think definitely that central bank independence is something that we should look at and make sure that it's not something that's independent of the functions of government. And then finally, I want to talk to you about education. What do you think about the way that the education system is currently structured? And how do you think that we can encourage more critical thinking within the education system to equip our young people for the future of work, especially amidst the AI revolution?
Well, again, I think decentralization is the way to do it. I mean, in the United States, we currently have the public school system. I know public private is reversed in Britain, but we have our government run schools and they're run as a monopoly. And then we have private schools. But what's happening in the United States is we're seeing a mini revolution in that over the last beginning of decade. Actually, it goes back much further, but it's really over the last decade that it's begun to gain a lot of force where instead of giving the school the money and then you're required as a student to go to that school, we're actually giving the student the money and then the student chooses or the parents choose where the child goes to school. And so it's introducing a lot of competition into the system. And again, I believe in democracy and I trust people to make the best decisions for themselves. Will they always do so? No. Would some parents send their child to school I wouldn't send my child to? Yeah, almost certainly. But the vast majority of people will make the right decisions for their child. And that's another big aspect of this is you send your child to a government school, that's a one size fits all process and that one size does not fit all children. Where I remember we sent our son was in a an advanced kindergarten class and then we moved and he went to a new school with a first grade and they only had one first grade and they weren't advanced at all. And he literally, he's a kid, he's a first grader. He literally would get bored in school because he was doing all the same stuff they had already done in kindergarten. And we asked the teacher, can you just give him something to, so he can do a little bit more work? And she go, oh, no, 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 no. Everybody in my class gets the same thing, right? No, everybody's the same. And
Yeah.
it just didn't work. We ended up having to pull him out and move him to a private school, which we then had to pay taxes for him to go to government school. And then we had to pay taxes again or school fees to send him to a private school. If the parents were able to pick the school that's best for their children, you would end up, you would lose a lot of the stuff. Because you know what? Parents are going to look at things like, are they being taught critical thinking? Are they being taught good history? Are they being propagandized and taught a whole bunch of stuff that's not true? And you can be true. I mean, I'm not saying that the schools are deliberately teaching things that are false, but one of the secrets about bias and propaganda, it's not so much in the lies that you tell. Most of it's in the truths that you do not tell. And it's the things you leave out that creates the bias more. So, yeah, all you have to do for critical thinking is ask for people to think. And so much of what we have in our schools today is antithetical to that. They don't want you to think, they want you to accept. And that's a
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah, it's really important that we actually look past the lens that power displays. We look past the stories that they tell us because Plato said that those who tell the stories rule society, and the people who have power now will be able to have power over us as long as they control the narrative. So that's why it's important that we think for ourselves and determine our own reality. We determine the real truth, not just what they're telling us is the truth. And it's really important what you also said about personalized education. Rather than having a homogeneous model of education, we can use tools like AI to personalize education to the needs of each student. And that's a shift that's really important, and it'll really accelerate the intellectual development of young people in the future. And that ties in more to what I want to ask you about AI. Do you think that it'll transform productivity and the structure of the economy? And will it finally lead to reduced working hours and that utopian vision that John Maynard Keynes envisaged when the first technological developments were coming into place decades ago, that we would have such short work weeks and there would barely be a need to work?
Well, that would be typical of my life if they're going to do that after I retire. But I think AI is going to be a tremendous problem going forward because we really need to have a bunch of questions that we sit down, we talk about, and we think about before they read. The normal mechanism is we ignore it, the problem it develops, becomes a crisis, and then we go, how do we get here? What do we do? Well, that's what AI is going to do to us. I'm of the belief, in fact, a podcast, we have a video coming out either next week or 2 weeks after that on AI and jobs. Because if you take AI and you combine it with robots, why do we even have a work week? I mean, what job would be left? There's not a job that an AI robot could not do. And right now, you can say, well, the price will come down, yeah, and you'll be able to get one in your home, and it'll be able to do all your housework for you. Okay, how are you going to pay for it? Right? These are solvable problems. Maybe we go to a basic economic income, but okay, how's that going to work and how's that going to function? Does everybody get the same income? What about the value of work and what that does? When I went through basic training, my TI told me basically, because in the US military, you can work for 20 years and then you can retire, right? And he said, if your plan, talking to 20-year-olds, if your plan is to work 20 years, retire at 40 and go fishing, you're going to be dead by 45, because if you don't have something you're doing, you will not survive. All right.
Yeah, it's going to destroy capitalism because there'll be no basis for competition. Because if everyone has a homogeneous level of income, then what difference will there be in society? That's why absolute equality is so damaging. And on one side, blue collar workers are being squeezed by robots, and then the white collar workers are being squeezed by the intellectual aspect of AI. That's why I think that we have to give workers a stake in the development, and we have to build the economy around cooperatives, around minimum worker ownership. And we actually have to give workers a stake in development by making sure that these new technologies augment workers rather than replace them. And that's how we give workers an economic stake in our future. And I think that ties into the fact that AI is going to have a transformative impact, and it's necessary because we do have to have innovation, and there is cycles of new technologies that always come around in the development of human societies, but we have to make sure that it serves our interests and that it serves the society that we want to build, not the society that tech barons want to build for their own interests and their own wealth and enrichment.
Well, you don't have to think about it as tech barons. It's just like you can think of it as, right now, early adopters always drive technology. And the example I use in the video, the flat screen TV came out in 1997. It was 42 inches, which was the largest TV you could get in those days. And it was $15,000, right? And you look at what early adopters, they bought those, which allowed for the third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation. What they did is the TVs got bigger and the cost went down. That's great. Who are the early adopters of AI? They're primarily businesses looking to get rid of employees. Well, that's not a trend we want to accelerate. But what's going to be its alternative? Again, this is a place where we as a society should look forward and say, how are we going to do this? What are we going to do? What does that look like? And what do we want it to be? And if we don't actually ask those questions until it's too late, our ability to answer them will be greatly constrained. And there's another issue that's coming up at the same time, which is as AI and robots are coming into place, world population is going to peak and start declining. We're kind of at a plateau right now where we're sort of at the top end of the curve. And within a couple of decades, we'll actually start a decline. You always see that in Europe big time. You see that in the United States, which is one of the reasons they need to bring people in. But what do we do that when that's the general trend? The world's never had to face depopulation before. World's never had to face AI robots before. The closest analogy would be ancient Rome when because of the conquest, they were sending huge amounts of slaves back into Italy, and they would take over the farms. And then the farmers would, well, no job here. I'm going to go to the city. They get to the city. Well, no jobs there. They're all being done by slaves. And you ended up with the bread and circuses and the Gracchi brothers and the downfall of the Republic and the emergence of the dictatorship under the Caesars. How do we deal with these problems? These are huge problems that we're on the cusp of, and very few people are talking about them. So, and for example, is innovation even possible with AI? AI basically crunches data and tells you what's there. And if what's there is, recycled hash, then you're going to get AI coming out with recycled hash. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, there's just a tremendous amount of problems that we haven't even really begun to address. How do you do government structures with AI? Even small things. Like, for example, we have what's called March Madness, where everybody picks out their brackets for college football, and the person that does best wins. Well, I'm talking to a friend of mine, and the one person in the two people that are leading in his office, his former office, both used AI to pick their bracket. And the one that's in the lead used AI completely. The one that's in, second place used AI, except for it left one bracket out. So she just picked one and that's lost. So how do you have a competition like that if everybody just goes out to AI and asks AI and AI does it for them? It's like, how, for example, the metaphor would be, how do you run the Olympics in 2060 where the athletes don't actually run, they just send their robots to run for them? We haven't even begun to talk about some of these issues, and yet they're coming. It's like a freight train. You can't stop it. And so you may be able to switch tracks and direct it, but you got to know what you want to switch tracks to first.
Okay, yeah. Thanks so much for your time. That's it for today. Where can people find you on social media and learn more about what work you do?
Well, with a name like Elgin Hushbeck, it's fairly unique. So if you Google that, you can pretty much find me. I'm on Amazon, I'm on YouTube. Our podcast is Into the Desert. And what we do is we try to talk about a lot of issues. And our focus is discussion, not division. So we want the other aspect, the way we define democracy is we define democracy not as defeating the other side, but as building the largest consensus that you can. So, those are the types of things we talk about and look at. But that's Into the Desert .info. It's on YouTube, or elginhushbeck.com for all of my books. And, or you can just go out to Google or anywhere. And, like I said, nice thing about having a unique name is, it's not like Tom Jones and you kind of figure out which of the thousands of them out there are you.
Yeah, that's definitely really important that we have discussion and debate and connection and community that transcends political divides and transcends and opposes the disunity and division that we have in society today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you
Thank
for
you
having
everyone for
me.
watching. Please make sure to like, subscribe, share, and follow on your favorite podcast platform. This has been Mission Undercover, and I hope to see you all next time.